Hey there, viewers. Sometimes the weight of what's about to happen is heavier than the moment itself. News just broke that one of Diddy's alleged victims will be testifying in court, and while she hasn't taken the stand yet, Diddy's reaction to the announcement left everyone around him disturbed. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Window in the Hallway. I don't think I ever planned on getting this close again. Not after the last time. But sometimes the job doesn't care what you're ready for, and sometimes the job ain't a job at all. It's just a thread you keep pulling until the whole thing falls apart. I ain't a writer, not in the poetic sense. I used to be a mechanic, 20 years in Greece and busted knuckles before a cousin got me doing contract courier runs for law offices. Quiet stuff, papers back and forth, mostly divorce filings and civil claims nobody wanted public. That's how I ended up circling the courthouses. That's how I learned who never looks you in the eye when they hand you something sealed. That's how I met her. I call her the woman behind the window. Truth is, I don't even know her name. Don't need to. She's been sitting behind that plexiglass partition in the courthouse records basement for as long as I can remember. Doesn't talk unless she has to. Wears those little glasses with the thick string around the neck. She moves like her body's already halfway into the grave, but her eyes see everything. Last week I came down late. The halls were already thinning out. Not quiet, not yet, but getting there. You know that hour before the real silence hits, where the hum of the fluorescence gets louder than the voices, and the sound of shoes on tile seems like it's coming from somewhere it shouldn't. That's when you know the courthouse is holding its breath. I don't like being around when buildings do that. I was carrying a small envelope for a mid-tier attorney handling something tied to the civil suits from last year. Nothing dramatic, but I lingered, didn't mean to. Something about the air was heavy, like the vents had stopped circulating. I approached her window with nothing new to ask, just routine stuff. I almost turned back. But then she looked up. Really looked. And said something she's never said to me before. She's testifying under her name. Just like that. 5 words, flat as rust, and yet it hit me like someone flipped a breaker in my stomach. I didn't say anything right away. Didn't need to. She slid a small manila folder toward me, tapped once on the edge, and leaned back into the shadow like her body wanted to disappear behind the file cabinets. I took it without asking questions, slipped it into my inner coat pocket like I had a right to it. We both knew I didn't, but in this place, silence is permission. Outside the office, the hall stretched, long and dim. The overhead lights flickered in that uneven way they do when no one's been maintaining them properly. Sick yellow shadows dancing on cracked tile, like the building was trying to stay awake against its will. I walked past a janitor cart, left unattended, and thought about what those 5 words meant. Cassie Ventura testifying, under her real name. That wasn't just news, that was tectonic. That was someone saying she didn't care what followed, that she wasn't afraid of being seen, and that meant others might not be afraid either. Which meant that maybe, just maybe, everything I'd been quietly circling around for the last 9 months was about to come out. Whether the system was ready or not. The thing about Diddy's empire, whatever's left of it, is that it was never just about music. It was about silence, control. The weight of reputation so big, it crushed questions before they ever reached daylight. And for a while it worked. Even when the lawsuits started stacking, the circles stayed tight. Even when that footage leaked, especially when it leaked. Folks clammed up like it was rehearsed. But Cassie going on the record, that cracked the seal. That wasn't an allegation anymore. That was a wound opening in public. I made my way toward the lower archive wing, not officially allowed down there, but after a few years of small favors and late-night coffee runs, the security guys stopped checking me so hard. I kept my head down, past the office doors with taped-over nameplates, and took a left into the storage hallway. That's when I noticed it. A window, about chest height, barely wider than a shoebox, embedded in the thick concrete wall. I'd passed it before, Always thought it was just one of those weird architectural leftovers from the 70s renovation. But this time there was a light on behind it. A single desk lamp glowing pale orange, casting a slant of warmth across what looked like hundreds of manila folders stacked in rows like tombstones. And in that window, a shape, human but unmoving, watching me. Maybe her, maybe not. I didn't stop walking, but I felt it in my chest. That building wasn't just made of walls, it was made of memory. And memory in a place like this doesn't sleep. It lingers, curls up in corners, presses against your back when you're not looking. I reached the last door in the hallway and knocked twice. No answer, just the hum of the old HVAC system rattling faintly through the vents. I tried the handle. It clicked open. Inside, a storage room that smelled like vinegar and damp paper. Filing cabinets, metal shelves, boxes marked with old case numbers. The kind of place records go when someone doesn't want them found but doesn't quite have the nerve to shred them. I waited. A creak behind me. I turned. She was there again, the woman from the window, standing in the doorway, her hands clasped. No coat, no ID badge, just her and a small, unmarked DVD case. She held it out to me like she was handing off a hot coal. "This was never supposed to be kept," she said. I took it. My fingers brushed hers for just a second. Her skin was colder than the room. She didn't explain, didn't need to. She turned and walked back down the hallway. I didn't follow. Not right away. I stared at the disc. Plain silver, no label. No markings. Just weight. Not physical, but the kind of weight you can feel in your spine, in your teeth. I didn't know what it showed yet, but I had a good guess. Back outside, the city had dipped into full evening. The courthouse steps felt longer than usual, like they'd grown overnight. I stood there, looking out over the street, thinking about Cassie, about the difference between surviving something and naming it. About what it costs to testify, not just in court, but in the eyes of everyone who pretended not to know. I thought about the things that don't get said out loud, about the lawyers who'd already left Diddy's team over the past few months, some quietly, some after conflicts of interest that never quite got explained. I thought about the way power starts to rot when people stop pretending it smells good. And then I tucked the disc deeper into my coat and started walking. I didn't know what the footage would show, but I had a feeling I wouldn't sleep easy after watching it. And I knew in my bones that whatever happened next, it had already started. Chapter 2, A Man in Holding, Not Yet on Trial. The first time I heard the story, I didn't believe it. The way the guard told it sounded too much like something out of a bad script. But I've learned not to dismiss strange details too quickly, especially when they come from men who've spent years inside those walls. Men who've seen what happens when power has nowhere left to go but inward. We were sitting in the back of a diner in Crown Heights 2 weeks before the trial. Rain smacked the windows like it was trying to get in. The booth reeked of bleach and old syrup. Across from me, Bernard Benny Torres, retired corrections officer, 30 years in and out of federal lockups, was on his second plate of fries. I had a lukewarm coffee and a recorder in my pocket, though I never turned it on. With Benny, it was always better to just let him talk. They had him in SHU, special housing, kept him tight, real tight, he said, not even looking at me as he spoke. Didn't make eye contact with the guards, didn't ask for anything for a whole week. Then, out of nowhere, one morning he starts pounding on the door like a damn animal, screaming for peanut butter. Not just any kind, organic, like that was something we had sitting on a shelf back there. I didn't interrupt. I just let the words spool out, knowing they always led somewhere. Refused his meals before that, Benny continued. Like 5 straight days, just water. And even that only after we left it and walked away. Then the peanut butter thing. Said he couldn't think without it. Said his mind was getting no traction. That's how he put it, no traction. What does that mean? I finally asked. Benny shrugged. Beats me, but the way he looked, I don't know, man. I've seen guys unravel before, you know the ones. They go in thinking they'll coast through because they're big names, rappers, actors, whatever. But when the silence hits, when it's just them and the walls, that's when you see what they're made of. And him? He leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper. You talk to the air? I blinked. To who? That's the thing. We'd check the cams, think maybe he had a visitor we didn't log. But nope, just him, sitting on the edge of the bunk, talking like someone was standing there. Not ranting, calm, polite, like he was catching up with an old friend. Always just after lights out. And you said he... What? Scratched himself? Yeah, wrists. Nothing suicidal, not that deep, just over and over, same spots. Didn't even complain about it. We'd see the blood on his cuffs, ask if he needed med attention. Nothing. Wouldn't even look at us. Kept scratching like he was trying to find something under the skin. I stared at my coffee as he spoke, trying to picture it. A man used to control, now pacing the perimeter of an 8x10 cell, whispering to ghosts and bleeding by choice. He kept saying a name, Benny added suddenly. I looked up. Cassie. Benny shook his head. No, that's the weirdest part. He never said her name, not once, but he kept saying a man's name over and over, quiet, like a chant. Carlos, sometimes Mr. Ventura. One night, he said, I didn't mean it, sir, just like that. I sat with that for a second. Jesse's father. I didn't know much about him. None of the lawsuits mentioned him directly. He'd stayed out of the press, out of everything, really. But Diddy whispering his name, that gave me a chill I didn't expect. There's something primal about that kind of guilt, like your mind dragging you back to the root of your own damage, bypassing the headlines and going straight for the quietest judgment. There's more, Benny said, rubbing his temples. Last week, someone smuggled a flash drive onto the block. Not sure how. We're still dealing with all kinds of leaks. Someone always knows someone. The inmates got hold of it, played it on a hacked tablet in the laundry room. It was that hotel footage. The 2016 tape, I asked. He nodded. Yep. The one with her in the hallway. Him chasing her, dragging her, kicking, all of it. I knew the one. I'd watched it myself, alone in my apartment at 2 in the morning. I'd only watched it once. You'd expect it to set them off, right? Benny said. But it didn't, at least not in the way you'd think. They didn't get mad. They didn't shout. They got quiet, like scared quiet. His point was clear. Exactly, Rosie said. While, I asked. That hallway, he said. One of the guys, Carter from 3B, swore he'd seen that hallway before. Not the video, the actual place. He said it looked exactly like a corridor from this old estate upstate. A place Diddy used to throw retreats, not a hotel, a house. Said he'd cleaned it once, back in the day, during one of those private weekends. Said the carpet, the sconce lighting, it matched, down to the water stain on the ceiling tile. Coincidence? Maybe. But then another guy said the same thing, and another. Guys who'd never been in the same crew, never crossed paths. They all kept saying the same thing. I've walked that hall before. I didn't know what to say to that. Still don't. It reminded me of something a paralegal told me last year. She'd been on the Cassie case when it was still in civil court. She only lasted 2 weeks before she quit. Said she saw something in the sealed testimony that made her skin crawl. Wouldn't say what. Just looked me in the eye and said, he built routines, not events. Routine for what? I asked her back then. She just said, power, through repetition. Now, sitting across from Benny, I thought back to that moment. Thought about what it means when a place reappears in memory. Not because you remember it, but because someone else made sure you would. That's why they're scared, Benny said, finishing the last of his fries. Not because they think he's dangerous, not anymore. He's in a cage. But because the memory doesn't stop. Because somehow, even from inside, he's still inside them. He paused. And maybe, he added, voice lower now, maybe they're afraid of what happens when that memory starts talking back. I paid the bill and walked out into the drizzle. The rain had gone soft, misting everything into ghost shapes. I kept thinking about that hallway, about the matching carpet and the silent panic, about how fear doesn't always shout. It whispers, it repeats, and it remembers. 2 weeks before the trial, and already the cracks were spreading. I couldn't help wondering what would happen when the door opened, and the voice that had been buried the longest was finally allowed to speak. Chapter 3. The gallery with no phones allowed. They took everything at the door. No phone, no pen, no notebook, not even the half-eaten mint I had shoved into my coat pocket. One by one, the security staff waved each item into a clear plastic tub and sealed it with a sticker that had no name, just a barcode and a timestamp. I watched my own hands vanish beneath rubber gloves and then reappear, lighter, emptier. There's a peculiar kind of silence that comes when everything familiar is taken from you, not just the objects, but the impulse to reach for them. You start noticing things you usually don't. The shift in air pressure when the courtroom doors open, the rhythm of footsteps down the hall, the sound of your own heartbeat in your eardrums. The gallery they placed me in was 3 rows from the back wall, right beneath a vent that ticked every few seconds like it had a loose screw. I sat between 2 people who didn't look at me. They didn't look at anyone, really. One wore a blazer with shoulder pads that sagged from heat. The other gripped the edge of the bench like he was bracing for turbulence. The benches were polished oak, the kind that absorb cold. Every seat squeaked, every movement echoed. I kept my back straight and my face forward. The judge had warned us there would be no sketch artists, no transcripts available to the public, no cameras. Not even the courtroom security feed would be saved during her testimony. What was said in that room would stay there. I wasn't supposed to be here. My credentials didn't qualify me for a restricted seat. But I knew someone in courthouse records, someone who owed me a favor from years ago, when I passed on a sealed tip that kept them from authorizing the wrong subpoena. That favor earned me a stamp on a form that got me a badge for a seat I shouldn't have had. I wore it under my coat like armor. The room was already half full when they let us in. No murmuring, no rustling of papers. Just rows of motionless bodies dressed in government gray and neutral tones, as if anyone with color had been filtered out at the door. The DA sat nearest the judge's bench, surrounded by a legal team that looked like they'd been awake for 3 straight days. The lead prosecutor, a woman whose name I hadn't bothered to learn because names changed too fast in court, rubbed her temples in circles, eyes closed. Her assistant tapped a pencil without writing anything. Then the air changed. I don't know how else to put it. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no doors slamming, just a drop in temperature so subtle you wouldn't have noticed it unless you were already cold. And we were. Everyone was. I felt it in the space between my shoulder blades. Others around me did too. One woman tugged her sleeves down to her knuckles. A man near the front rubbed his palms together like he'd just come in from winter. Then she entered. Cassie Ventura walked in flanked by 2 plainclothes marshals. No cuffs, no dramatics, just a long black coat and eyes that didn't look up. She kept her gaze low like she was reading the tile. The room didn't breathe, not out of reverence, out of something else. Something like fear, but quieter. She took the stand. The judge adjusted her glasses. The defense shuffled some papers that didn't need shuffling, and then she spoke. Honey, we didn't hear it. Not truly. I mean, technically, we heard her voice. It traveled, carried by the mic on the witness stand, but I couldn't remember a single word she said. Even now, I can't quote her. I just remember what happened around her words, what they did to the room. The assistant DA closed her eyes and kept them closed for minutes at a time. A marshal leaned against the wall and suddenly straightened like he'd been poked. One of the federal agents assigned to security shifted in his seat, looked down at his hands, and didn't raise his head again for the next 20 minutes. And across the aisle, a woman from Diddy's defense team stood up. Slow, careful, and walked out. She didn't come back. No one followed her. No one asked. I watched the man himself closely. He was seated just behind the defendant's table, surrounded by federal guards, flanked by a lawyer who hadn't said a word since the session started. Diddy's hands were folded in his lap, motionless, his jaw flexed once, then again. At one point, maybe 30 minutes in, maybe longer, he leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. I couldn't hear it, no one could, but whatever it was, she didn't reply. She didn't move at all, just stared forward, her knuckles white around the edges of the legal pad she hadn't touched. And still Cassie spoke. The transcript would be sealed, that was the agreement. Her choice, her testimony wouldn't be published or released. Only a closed room of select officials would ever know the full scope of what she said. But her voice carried weight that didn't need words. And as I watched the faces of the courtroom shift, stiffen, crack, drop, I realized what real testimony looked like. It wasn't just facts. It wasn't bullet points or timelines. It was feeling. It was a raw, unflinching mirror, held up to every man and woman who had looked the other way when things didn't quite make sense, when the stories started adding up and no one wanted to do the math. I caught one of the guards near the entrance mouthing something, not prayer, not curses, just a phrase over and over. We should have stopped it. There was a moment, near the end, where everything seemed to slow. Not literally, but like the air got thick. You could almost hear it pressing in. I looked down at the floor and saw a long hairline crack in the tile. Nothing major, probably old, but the way it split the pattern, jagged and quiet, it felt like something deeper than wear and tear. It felt like the start of something unraveling. She finished speaking. I know that because the judge called for a recess. That's when we all exhaled, as if on cue. Like we'd been holding our breath so long, we'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. Cassie stood, walked off the stand, the same way she came in. No glance backward, no falter, just gone. The marshal near the wall finally sat down. Diddy didn't move. The lawyer beside him still hadn't unclenched her hands. And I sat there, trying to replay her words in my head, trying to remember anything she'd actually said. But all I had were impressions, faces, silence, that sudden cold, and the thought that this was just the beginning, the first tremor before the collapse. Outside, when I got my belongings back, my phone buzzed with 2 missed calls. No texts, just a message from a colleague. You were in there? What did she say? I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. She said enough. Chapter 4. He didn't return to his cell the same. I met Benny in a dim bar tucked away in Queens, a low-lit joint known only to those whose lives run on midnight shifts. It was past 2 in the morning, and the hum of conversation blended with the clink of glasses and the low strains of an old blues record. I recognized him immediately, one of the few night guards who'd served in SHU long enough to have seen the strange and inexplicable. His voice, when he began, was low and gravelly with regret. Listen, I don't like talking about it, but I gotta say what I saw, Benny muttered as we settled into a secluded booth. He avoided direct eye contact, his fingers nervously twisting a napkin. When Mr. Combs came back from the courtroom that day, it wasn't the same man we knew. I leaned in, signaling that I was ready to capture every detail, even if his words trembled on the edge of disbelief. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly and began in a hushed tone. He returned to Shu looking like he was in shock, like everything he'd ever built was suddenly crumbling around him. The second he stepped through the cell block door, he didn't look at anyone. He didn't even acknowledge us. He just went straight to his cell. Benny paused, shaking his head slowly, eyes darting around as if fearing someone might be listening. I followed him from a distance. I know it sounds crazy, but he just stopped. He stood by the concrete wall in his cell for 6 hours without blinking. I shouted his name a few times. "Diddy, hey Diddy!" But he didn't answer. I sipped my water slowly, silently urging him to continue. Benny's recounting was measured, each pause laden with a weight that felt as if it pressed down on the very soul of the building. After what felt like an eternity, I swear I heard him speak. It was a whisper at first, so soft I could hardly catch it over the din of the cell block. But it became clearer. It was like a broken record repeating the same phrase. She did it. She said it. And then, as if startled by his own words, he laughed. But the laugh wasn't a natural one. It was mechanical. It didn't have any warmth, just a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the walls of that tiny cell. Benny's eyes glazed over for a moment as he recalled that sound. It was as if he wasn't even there, a puppet controlled by something beyond himself. I've seen plenty of men break under pressure, but nothing like this. He rubbed his temples with a calloused hand before leaning closer. You know, some of the other guards swore they heard strange noises later that night. Not just his laugh, but something else. There were pages from a court transcript folded up like origami, left scattered in the corridor. No one admitted to putting them there, but everyone knew they were from Cassie's testimony. I frowned, my pulse quickening. Origami pages, that sounds almost surreal. Benny nodded. It does, doesn't it? And that wasn't all. When I made my rounds the next shift, I found a sink in the corridor that was inexplicably wet. No one had used it. It just dripped constantly, as if the room were weeping. And then there was that music. Soft gospel music playing backward, looping over and over. I couldn't trace where it was coming from. The usual hum of the ventilation was replaced by that odd melody, and the whole block felt disturbed, as if it were echoing something beyond the normal routine. He swallowed hard, and I could tell that each word was a struggle. Later that night, as I was doing my final patrol, I noticed something on the window of his cell. It was a smudge. Not just any smudge. A line, like someone had scrawled a sentence. I leaned in, and it read exactly like a line from Cassie's testimony. But no ink was allowed in Shu that week. There was no chance anyone could have written that, not officially. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard enough about sealed testimonies and redacted transcripts to understand the gravity of what Benny was saying. So, you're saying it's like his entire being, his mind, fractured by what he heard? I asked softly. Benny nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. It's like something inside him just broke off. I overheard a couple of inmates whispering about Wild King nights, a term they use for when someone in here shifts, almost like the man isn't fully there anymore. They say that even if he's still physically present, his mind is lost somewhere else, a dark place where memories and regrets mix with something far more sinister. I kept my gaze fixed on Benny's weathered face, reading the lines of worry and regret etched deeply into his skin. Did anyone try to help him? Any of the medical staff or counselors? He shook his head slowly. Not really. He wouldn't let anyone near him. I saw a doctor come by once, just check on him, but he didn't speak. There was a moment when I thought he might cry, that he'd break completely, but then he just sat there, staring at that wall like it held all his secrets. When he whispered those words, it was like a switch flipped inside him. His eyes, they got distant, like he was watching someone else living his life. I scribbled a few notes, trying to capture the rawness of his account without interfering. I asked cautiously, "And the laugh? Did it change after that? Was it different from before?" Benny let out a long sigh, his eyes unfocused as if looking into a place I couldn't see. I can't say exactly. All I remember is that it was out of place. It wasn't the laugh of a man who was just apologetic or regretful. It was robotic, as if his body was on autopilot. After that, he hardly spoke for the rest of the night. I don't recall anyone else hearing him say a word. It was like he was paralyzed by his own thoughts. I leaned back, letting his story settle in the quiet between us. The implications were maddening. A man who had commanded a sprawling empire now reduced to whispers and silence. It was more than just the weight of guilt. It was the collapse of control. And somehow, all these inexplicable events, the origami pages, the dripping sink, the strange music, were woven into the fabric of that collapse. They suggested that what Cassie had testified was not just an isolated moment, but a trigger that cracked something deep within him. Benny finished his drink without ceremony, and I could tell he was done speaking, his voice spent. I paused, staring at the condensation on my glass, thinking about how facts and rumors blended in the corridors of a high-security cell block. There was a terrible poetry to it all. A man who once ruled with charisma, now haunted by echoes of his own actions, and a place where even the inanimate objects seemed to remember. When I left the bar that night, my mind churned with questions. How could a single testimony transform an individual? What secret was locked behind that whispered name, she said it, that could make someone as formidable as Diddy, dissociate into a silent, broken figure? And were these strange occurrences isolated incidents, or were they part of a larger hidden mechanism inside Shu that reflected the decay within his legacy? I couldn't know for certain. All I had were fragments, a recollection from a gravelly voice, a smear on a cell window, a broken laugh echoing in a cold corridor. In the labyrinth of Shu, where every sound and every gesture takes on a life of its own, the truth was as elusive as the light in a forgotten corner. Yet one thing was clear. After Cassie's testimony, Diddy wasn't the man anyone remembered him to be. He was a shadow of himself, caught in a net of his own making, and the silence he now carried was heavier than any verdict could ever be. I took a slow, measured step into the night, the city lights blurred by rain, feeling as though I carried a burden far greater than a story. In a place where every whispered detail held the weight of an empire, I knew that the coming days would reveal more than just legal battles. They would expose the deep fissures in a man's soul, and perhaps the quiet horror of a system built on silence. Chapter 5. The Woman with the Locked Drawer. The building felt different. I'd walked into the federal courthouse 100 times before, maybe more, and never once had it felt like this. Not even during the early hearings, not during the settlements or the sealed motions, or when I passed a man down the hall and later found out he'd signed a gag order the next morning. That was all part of the business, the way the machine kept itself running. Loud on the outside, but always too quiet where it mattered. But now, 2 days after Cassie's testimony, something had shifted. You could feel it, in the floors, in the paper, in the people. I was back for the transcripts. That's what I told myself. I wanted to see what the court would officially commit to paper. I knew Cassie's words wouldn't be fully included. Sealed testimony was sealed for a reason, but I wanted to see what was missing, what was redacted, what had been scrubbed clean. Sometimes, the absence of information tells you more than the details ever could. I made my way down to the storage office in the basement. It was early enough that most of the clerks weren't in yet, which was exactly how I liked it. The hallway lights flickered, the fluorescent hum louder than usual. Something about it grated more than it used to. I passed the old maintenance door with the peeling paint, took a right at the vending machines, and came to a stop in front of her window. The woman behind the glass was already sitting there. Same gray cardigan, same reading glasses on a beaded string, but she wasn't doing her usual work. No typing, no filing, no stamps. She was just sitting still, hands folded in her lap like someone waiting for a verdict. Her expression was hard to read. She was always a little hard to read, but today there was something underneath the usual flatness, something off. I tapped gently on the glass. She looked up, and for the first time since I'd known her, her eyes didn't meet mine right away. They wandered slightly, unfocused, like she'd just woken up from a bad dream she didn't want to explain. Then she blinked, rose from her chair, and disappeared into the back room without saying a word. I waited. The old radiator clunked somewhere behind me. A cart of labeled folders creaked slowly by, pushed by a man who didn't look up. The hallway felt like it had been stretched an extra foot in each direction, like the space itself didn't want to be familiar anymore. When she came back, she was holding a thin manila folder. Not the thick court packet I expected, not even a summary, just a small, nearly empty file with my last name scribbled in blue ink across the top, in handwriting that looked rushed. She slid it under the glass without speaking. Her hand lingered there, resting on the edge, like she wasn't quite ready to let it go. I took the file, opened it. 3 pages, all stamped, all official. They contained summary notes of the trial session, with the expected legal preamble, courtroom roster, timestamps, and procedural language, but the section marked Testimony, Victim 1 stopped abruptly after 2 paragraphs, mid-sentence. I looked up at her. She was still staring at the space between us, unmoving. "Own page is missing," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than usual, strained. "Missing?" I asked. She nodded. It never printed. I didn't speak, just stared at her through the glass, trying to understand what she wasn't saying. "I mean it literally," she added. "I ran the job twice. It skipped the same page both times. Digital and hard copy, it's not a jam, it's not a glitch. The file is there, the number is there, but it won't render." I flipped the pages in the folder. There was a faint indentation on the last page, like someone had tried to copy text by pressing into it with a pen that had run out of ink. You could barely make out the impression of a line. I tilted it under the light. Just 1 sentence. "He told me what to say when I woke up. I hadn't spoken yet, but he already had my words." I scribbled it down in my notepad, one of the only places left where I still trusted the words to stay put. When I looked up again, she had sat back down. Her posture was rigid. She was staring at her own hands now, folded tight, thumbs pressed together, like she was bracing against something internal. "You ever seen someone stop moving?" she asked, voice low. I wasn't sure what she meant. "I mean really stop," she said again. "Not sleeping, not thinking, just frozen, like the body still remembers how to sit but forgot everything else." I nodded slowly. "Did he?" She didn't say yes. Didn't need to. "He didn't blink for 30 minutes, she said. "One of the clerks saw it on the feed. They had to cut the live monitor because it made people uncomfortable. Said it looked wrong, like a photograph." We sat in silence. She opened her drawer, the one with the small silver key that always jingled on her wrist chain. Usually she kept it locked tight. I'd only ever seen it open once, by accident, when she was searching for an old pre-indictment case number and forgot I was standing there. This time she opened it slowly, deliberately. She pulled out a sheet of yellow legal paper, creased, slightly torn at the edges but filled with neat handwriting. She stared at it, puzzled. "I don't remember writing this," she said, "but it's mine. I recognize the ink, the weight. My pen drags on one side when I'm tired. See there?" She pointed to the slanted W's, the faint double pressure lines under certain letters. I leaned closer. The note was short, no names, no dates, just 1 sentence repeated 3 times, each one more scrawled than the last. He built a script and cast her as silence. "Do you know what it means?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't," I said, though the words felt too familiar, too pointed, like something that had been circling my thoughts for days without permission. She folded the note again and tucked it back into the drawer. "I keep dreaming I'm in a courtroom," she whispered. "But it's empty. No judge, no jury, just seats. And something behind the curtain. Breathing. She closed the drawer, locked it. "I'm taking a few days off," she said finally. "You shouldn't come back down here, not for a while." I didn't argue. I knew when I'd been dismissed. As I walked back through the hallway, the lights flickered again. The buzzing of the radiator grew louder, like it was grinding its own teeth. I felt eyes on me. None I could see, but I didn't turn around. Outside, the sky had gone gray, even though the forecast said clear. The air felt thicker than it should have. I paused at the corner, looked back at the courthouse building. It didn't look like justice anymore. It looked like a stage no one remembered building, with actors who no longer knew their lines. And somewhere inside, a drawer was locked, but not empty. Chapter 6. The other victims refused to enter. I wasn't supposed to be in the jury anteroom. That kind of space was usually guarded with clipped badges and clipped tones. But after days of floating through courthouse corridors like a ghost with a notebook, I'd picked up the right habits. When to linger, when to duck a badge, when to walk like I belonged. Sometimes access isn't granted. It's assumed. The room itself didn't look like much. Pale walls, scuffed tile, folding chairs arranged in 2 uneven rows. A carafe of water sat half-drained on a cart by the wall next to a stack of untouched styrofoam cups. It could have passed for a DMV waiting area, if not for the tension so thick it clung to every surface. I wasn't the only one who felt it. A bailiff leaned against the doorframe, one boot tapping the tile in slow, uneven rhythm. He was young, too young for the bags under his eyes. When I asked how things were going, he let out a low whistle and shook his head. "They're not coming in," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "The victims?" He nodded. 3 of them were scheduled to walk through. Basic protocol before testimony. Get familiar with the space, see where they'll sit, where they'll stand. 1 didn't even make it past the elevator. Full-blown panic attack. The EMTs had to wheel her out. I waited, let the silence do the pulling. Another one got to the monitor room, he added. Just a side hall. She was fine, quiet, calm. But there was a monitor someone forgot to shut off. It had a paused feed, Combs from his last appearance, just sitting there, his face. She screamed, like really screamed, not scared, hurt, like she'd been struck. I glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the stillness again. "And the third?" He looked over his shoulder, lowered his voice. "She wouldn't go near the hallway. Said it smelled wrong. Not bad, just wrong, like old perfume in mildew. Said it was the same smell from a night she couldn't remember." That phrase hit me harder than I expected. A night she couldn't remember. I'd heard variations of it before, whispered in courtrooms and waiting rooms and therapy intake forms. But this one came wrapped in a new kind of dread. I thanked the bailiff and made my way toward the private corridor near the witness prep area. A legal aide from the DA's office intercepted me. Nervous, fidgety, one of those people who always looks like they're about to drop a stack of papers they're not supposed to be carrying. She pulled me aside like she'd been waiting to speak. "They asked me to print prep questions," she said, "for the victims. Simple stuff, grounders, timeline prompts, memory jogs. But one of them looked at the list and asked me something I didn't expect." I tilted my head. "What?" She swallowed. She said, "Will he do to my voice what he did to hers?" The hallway felt colder all of a sudden. I didn't know how to respond. "She meant Cassie, obviously," the aide continued. "But the way she said it, I don't know. Like she was afraid her words wouldn't come out the way she meant them to, like maybe he'd stolen something and might use it again." The phrasing sat with me as I made my way back to the records wing. I couldn't shake it. Do to my voice what he did to hers. It wasn't just about fear. It was about distortion, manipulation, the possibility that the most intimate part of you, your voice, could be taken and repurposed. I stopped by the old bench outside the records office, a quiet spot where I'd written hundreds of lines over the past year. I pulled out my notebook, the one I used when I didn't want a digital trail. I flipped back through pages from the early days of the trial. My scribbles, overheard quotes, courtroom sketches done in jittery ballpoint. And then I saw it. A line I hadn't written. It was right there in the margins, scrawled in a different hand, in darker ink. They'll believe her because she doesn't want them to. I stared at it, my breath catching. I didn't remember writing that. I didn't remember anyone writing in this notebook but me, and yet the sentence curved like a thought I'd been trying to form but couldn't. It was too precise, too knowing. I flipped the page. Nothing. The rest of my notes were intact, untouched. But that one line stood out like a wound that hadn't healed properly. I heard footsteps coming and quickly shut the book. Down the hallway, I passed a deputy I recognized from the security detail. He didn't say anything, just nodded, solemn, like we were in a hospital, like silence had become the official language of this place. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the events of the day like a film reel that refused to end. The panic attack, the scream, the smell, the voice, the sentence that appeared where it shouldn't have. And I kept coming back to that courtroom, not as a place of justice anymore. It didn't feel like that. It felt like something older, something ritualistic, a stage where silence was both the punishment and the performance. They'd built it well, every light, every bench, every step choreographed. But beneath it, something was slipping, something deeper. You could feel it in the reactions of the people who were supposed to be safe, victims who couldn't even walk into the room, legal staff who were starting to forget what they'd done just hours before. And now even the paper wasn't staying clean. The voices were still trying to speak, but it felt like someone or something was twisting them, like the truth wanted out, but the script kept changing mid-sentence. That line haunted me long into the night. They'll believe her because she doesn't want them to. And for the first time since this trial began, I realized something terrifying. Maybe silence isn't what they fear. Maybe silence is what speaks loudest of all. Chapter 7. The Transfer That Never Was. The first call came from a number I didn't recognize. No name, just a gruff voice and a 6-word warning before the line cut out. They moved him, Unit K, find it. That was it. At first I thought it was a prank. Wouldn't be the first time. Every case this big draws its share of trolls, tipsters, and paranoid hangers-on. But something about the voice stuck with me. It didn't sound like someone looking to stir trouble. It sounded like someone afraid they'd waited too long to speak. The next morning, I made my way to MDC Brooklyn. I didn't expect answers, but I wanted to see how hard the building would resist the question. The front desk clerk was different, new maybe, or maybe rotated in. Either way, he wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked about Combs' location. Same place he's always been, he said too fast. Shoo. Special housing. I asked if he'd been there since the testimony. He didn't answer. Any visitation logs? I pressed. Confidential, he snapped, then waved me along like I was a smudge on the glass. Downstairs, near the security checkpoint, I ran into an old face. Clarence, a technician I'd spoken to during a blackout a few weeks earlier. He remembered me, barely. You hear about the transfer? I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. No such thing. Even unofficially? He glanced around. You're barking up the wrong hallway. I didn't push further. Not yet. But the silence was telling. Silence in places like this isn't passive. It's deliberate. I waited until lunch, when staff shifts loosened and the side corridors became less patrolled. I slipped down toward the lower level where paper records still passed hands. I knew who to look for. Janice, the file clerk, with a sharp tongue and a habit of leaving drawers ajar when no one was watching. She didn't speak when I approached, just dropped a folder into the bin and reached into her cardigan pocket. What she pulled out wasn't a folder, but a folded scrap of notepad paper. She slid it into the bin, on top of the documents, eyes never leaving her monitor. I retrieved it without ceremony. It read, "Ask about Unit K. Ask why there's no camera there." No signature, no embellishment, just those words, scrawled fast and slanted like they'd been written under a desk. I didn't know what Unit K was. I'd been through every public schematic of MDC Brooklyn. A through H, yes, I, J, even L. But K? It wasn't on any map, and maybe that was the point. I tried again at the shoe corridor. This time I didn't ask questions, I just observed. The corridor smelled like bleach, not the usual maintenance clean, but cover-up clean, a kind of smell that says something happened and someone wanted it forgotten. But beneath it was something else, sour, like something had gone bad under the floor tiles. I didn't linger. One of the guards was finishing a patrol and I recognized him, a heavy-set man named Warren who used to nod politely whenever I came through. Today, he looked through me. "You seen him?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not my floor. Last time." Couldn't say. I followed him to the break room, waited until he was alone with his sandwich, and tried a different angle. Someone said there's no camera in Unit K. That got his attention. He froze mid-bite, then slowly lowered the sandwich. "There's no Unit K," he said flatly. "But if there was..." He stood up, tray in hand. "Then we wouldn't be talking about it." And that was the end of that. Later that afternoon, I caught Clarence again, this time coming out of the maintenance corridor with a laptop and a coil of cabling over his shoulder. He looked exhausted. "You ever get weird feedback in the intercom system?" I asked. He didn't answer, but his shoulders stiffened. I kept going. Heard a report of some interference, a voice repeating something. Clarence glanced around. No one nearby. He sighed. It came from cell 17C. That's where he was. What? They moved him. But not to SHU. And not to Gen Pop. I don't know where. No one does. And the interference. He scratched the back of his neck. It looped. Same phrase over and over. Female voice. Faint like a whisper under static. What'd it say? He hesitated. It said, he said I'd forget. Over and over. Then it just cut to static. Nothing we did could trace the origin. It wasn't in the software. It wasn't on the logs. You record it? Didn't need to. It's still in my head. I left MDC feeling like the building itself had exhaled something wrong. The halls felt narrower than before. The light didn't sit right on the floor tiles. Everything was too clean, too smooth. I got home around midnight. The hallway to my apartment smelled like old paint and wet metal. I checked my mailbox out of habit and found nothing. But when I stepped inside, there was an envelope on the floor. No name, no stamp, no markings, just beige paper sealed shut. I opened it slowly. Inside was a photo, grainy, black and white, clearly from a security feed. It showed the interior of a prison cell, bare walls, metal bunk, single sink. Carved into the concrete just above the bed frame were the words. She finished it. There was nothing else, no timestamp, no camera angle, just that single image. I stared at it for what felt like hours. The carving was crude but deliberate, not scratched in a rush, etched with pressure, like every word had been pressed in by hand, over and over, until the wall accepted it. She finished it. The words rang louder than any verdict I'd ever heard. Not a confession, not a threat, a closing sentence, a final act. And the more I stared, the more I realized I didn't know who had written it. Was it him? Or was it her? Or someone else entirely? I set the photo on my desk and turned off the lights. In the dark, I could still see the letters glowing in my mind. Whatever Unit K was, wherever they had moved him, something had changed. Not just in him, but in the story. And the story wasn't finished yet. Chapter 8. The courtroom is empty now. The courthouse was quiet in a way that didn't feel like silence. It felt like aftermath, like something loud had happened and the walls were still trying to forget it. I arrived before sunrise. The front steps were damp from a storm that had passed without warning. I'd been here so many times before, usually with tension in my chest, a camera-ready smirk on the bailiff, and the ever-present rustle of suits prepping their clients for another day of combat. But that day, no one greeted me. The front desk was unmanned, the security scanners were off, even the air smelled different. Metallic, scorched, like an old fuse box had blown out and no one remembered fixing it. The trial hadn't ended, not officially, but it had paused. That's how people kept saying it, paused, as if the court had pressed a button and everyone just stopped moving. No announcement, no order. The calendar still had another witness scheduled, but they never showed. One of the paralegals told me they'd simply vanished. Bags packed, apartment cleared, no forwarding address. It didn't feel like coincidence. Nothing in this case did anymore. When I reached the courtroom, the double doors were already propped open. That was strange, too. This room had been guarded like a vault. Now, the lock hung loose, like it had stopped mattering. Inside, it was even stranger. Chairs had been pushed askew, some flipped slightly out of their straight lines. The walls looked darker than before, just a shade. But it gave the space the feel of a stage after the curtain falls and the cast has gone home. It smelled like cleaner, but not the usual lemony court issue stuff. This was stronger. Something harsh, something burnt. A janitor moved slowly along the wall near the judge's bench, an old man with a hunched back and eyes that seemed too tired to focus. He was scrubbing something with a bristle brush and a blank look. "You're early," he said without looking up. "Just wanted to walk through," I replied. He kept scrubbing. They told us to clean everything, but no one said what we were cleaning. "What do you mean?" He paused. "We've cleaned worse," he said quietly, "but never for something still sitting in the room." That line hung in the air longer than it should have. I moved slowly down the aisle, boots echoing against the hard floor. Sunlight was breaking through the high windows, casting long geometric shadows across the space. I paused near the prosecution table, then glanced toward the witness stand. That's when I saw it. A circular burn beneath the judge's bench, no bigger than a dinner plate, but deep, scorched into the tile, black around the edges with fine cracks radiating outward like a spider web. It didn't look like an electrical accident. It looked intentional, like something had marked the room, claimed it. The janitor didn't explain. I didn't ask. I wandered toward the far corner of the room, past where the bailiffs used to stand with arms crossed and eyes blank. I stood near the wall and looked down. And that's when the light shifted. A beam of sun hit the floor at a precise angle just across from where I stood. The shape it cast stopped me cold. It was long, narrow, with a sharp turn at one end. It was the hallway, the one from the video, the one where he chased her, dragged her, kicked her, the Intercontinental. But it wasn't a shadow, it was light. I stepped into it. The moment I did, it felt like the air pressed in, like the room inhaled me. I knelt down, heart pounding, and that's when I saw the paper. It was torn, faded, just a corner of a page, but it hadn't been there before. Not when I entered, not when I stood in this very spot moments ago. I picked it up. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were legible. When I said no, he said the cameras would say yes. I didn't move. I couldn't. That one sentence weighed more than the hours of courtroom rhetoric that had filled this room over the past weeks. It said everything. It was all in there. Coercion, power, silence, erasure. A voice trying to exist in a world determined to mute it. I turned slowly toward the defense table. Empty now, just chairs and papers and the ghost of something larger. I thought of Diddy, of how still he'd gone during Cassie's testimony, how even now no one knew exactly where he was, officially still in custody, unofficially, who could say? I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photo from a few nights ago, the one someone had left at my door, the image of his cell, the words carved into the wall. She finished it. Now, with the torn piece of testimony in one hand and the photo in the other, the meaning sank deeper than before. This wasn't about a trial, not anymore. It was about legacy, about undoing the silence that power had welded into place. And it had worked, for years, maybe decades, until someone spoke, until she spoke. I walked slowly down the aisle one last time, past the jury box, past the judge's chair. I touched the edge of the burn mark beneath the bench. It was still warm. Outside, the city moved like it always did. No one on the street knew the courtroom was empty. No one knew what had or hadn't happened inside, and maybe they wouldn't care. But I did. I stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, pulled out my notebook, and wrote one final line. He built his empire on silence. But when she spoke, the silence didn't just break, it shattered him.